David Rothman is the director of the graduate program in creative writing at Western State Colorado University and a past president of the Robinson Jeffers Association. He's also resident poet for Colorado Public Radio and poet laureate of Colorado's Western Slope. A poet, author, and scholar, his most recent book is an edited collection, Bell Turnbull, on the Life and Work of an American Master, which came out in 2017. In order to reach a deeper understanding of the poet's work, Professor Rothman today will attempt to reconcile Jeffers' love for place with, quote, his at times seemingly contradictory refusal to acknowledge a human relation to it, close quote. Please welcome David Rothman.
What a privilege and an honor to be here. I last gave a talk to at this gathering 21 years ago. At that time, I was over 6 feet tall, and I had, well, somewhat more hair. But I'll do my best to be an appropriate footnote to the wonderful talks that came before me, which were just wonderful, as always, from these folks. It's a wonderful gathering to see so many old friends and see people I've known here for many years. It's a great honor to be here. I want to especially thank Vince Huth for his incredible work with the foundation for so many years. Truly great leadership. And Al and Stacy for helping so much to put this together. So my talk dovetails with the others that went this morning. I always learn at these events, and I learned a great deal from both of them. In some ways, you'll see that I reinforce what Jim said. In other ways, you'll see that I disagree, and we'll take it from there. It's a close examination of the poems and of some words in the poems as poems. We'll see how this goes. So I'm going to begin because I want to put Jeffers into the air by reading the only poem in which he uses the word place in the title. Excuse me, and I think, of course, most of you will recognize this. It's already been alluded to, but I'm going to read the whole thing. It's short. The Place for No Story. I should also say I want to thank, in particular, Rob Kafka, who gave me access to his concordance of Jeffers, which is an incredibly useful tool, and you'll hear more about that. But this is, so I can confirm that as far as I can tell, the Place for No Story is the only poem by Jeffers that uses the word place in its title. The coast hills at Sovranes Creek, no trees, but dark, scant pasture drawn thin over rock shaped like flame. The old ocean at the land's foot, the vast gray extension beyond the long white violence. A herd of cows and the bull far distant, hardly apparent up the dark slope, and the gray air haunted with hawks. This place is the noblest thing I have ever seen. No imaginable human presence here could do anything but dilute the lonely, self-watchful passion. There are many varieties of literary criticism: philological, cultural, aesthetic, historical, textual, and so on. Too frequently, it can seem these days, cultural criticism, the dominant mode, takes the form of strident hermeneutic suspicion, as if one could interrogate the silent imaginations of the dead to reveal their complicity in corrupt or corrupting conspiracies of power. And yet there are so many other ways in which poems and poets can help us to understand how we think and feel, and why it matters, however bound by time and place. The only reason strong poems are worth reading at all is because they can do this, help us to understand how we think and feel in ways that continue to surprise us at the same time as they convince us of their accuracy or even occasionally their truth. If anything, the strongest poems do not really allow us to interrogate them at all. For wherever we think we are going, we meet the strong poet on the way back. As Wallace Stevens wrote in the poem Man Carrying Thing, The poem, and it's a poem, not an essay. The poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. And in that resistance, it is the poet's internal quarrel and anxiety, powerfully achieved, not resolved, that then draws us in if we will allow it to do so. So it is in Jeffers' vision of what a place is and what our place might be in places. Because places are embodied, having extension just as living bodies do, our conception of them is important if for no other reason than the fact that they are constitutive of experience. And yet, as Jeffers points out to us again and again, there are problems with what a place is and therefore with what reality is, if we are to be honest about it. And it is out of this paradox and others like it, which is really a quarrel with himself, that much of his poetic strength flows. The sense and sacredness of place was crucial, as we all know here, to Jeffers' mature vision from the start. And I'm going to quote some things that other people have already quoted because these are clearly the high points. There's some of the high points in this conversation that they're going to come up again and again. According to Lawrence Clark Powell, Jeffers' note, and I haven't seen this myself, I'm sure Jim has. I don't have a copy of it, but I got it from Powell. Jeffers' note on the first edition dust jacket of Roan Stallion reads in part, quote, "When the stagecoach topped the hill from Monterey and we looked down through the pines and sea fogs on Carmel Bay, it was evident that we had come, without knowing it, to our inevitable place." I expect most of you are familiar with this. It is an immediately arresting choice of words, even in prose. The place, this place right here, clearly appeared both to Jeffers and to Una as, quote, unavoidable. Though this is clearly not true in any literal sense. They could have gone around. They could have taken another road. Further, how can something that one does not know also be clear? And how can that unknown thing that is clear then also be inevitable if one did not even know what it was or that it was going to happen? Finally, how can a place behave like an event? And Jim talked a bit about this. After all, inevitability is a judgment about time or occurrence, not extension or space. I've never heard anybody say, Canada was inevitable or something like that. How can something defined by extension be inevitable? Presumably then, Jeffers requires us to readjust if we are to make any sense of the sentence, seeing the place in relation to time, presumably in this case, the narrative of his and Una's lives. In this way, even in the brief narrative of first coming upon the place that would loom so large in his work, Jeffers throws contradiction upon paradox at us. It seems, if we try to unpack all of this, that what Jeffers is saying is that he and Una were looking for something, some place to live at that time in 1914, and without realizing that Carmel was the place they were destined to live, they nonetheless realized immediately when they saw it that something greater than them had drawn them to it. In this formulation, we already see Jeffers' conception of human life as being driven by forces greater than itself, for the sentence is almost impossible to construe without some notion of fate that transcends human choice. For how else could it become evident that someone had done something inevitable without knowing it? It's almost like Oedipus or something. It's really a very strange sentence. Very beautiful, very powerful, but when we unpack it, it's pretty odd. For the rest of his life, as everyone here recognizes, Jeffers associated this place, Carmel, the Big Sur, the Central California coast, with this mysterious and transcendent sense of fate. As he famously wrote in the foreword to his 1938 selected poetry, and again, I'm going to read it, but it's a passage which, feel free to, read along with me, recite. Everybody knows this. A second piece of pure accident, the first being the meeting with Una, brought us to the Monterey Coast Mountains, where for the first time in my life, I could see people living amid magnificent, unspoiled scenery, essentially as they did in the Idylls or the Sagas or in Homer's Ithaca. Here was life purged of its ephemeral accretions. Men were riding after cattle or plowing the headland covered by white seagulls as they have done for thousands of years and will for thousands of years to come. Here was contemporary life that was also permanent life and not shut from the modern world but conscious of it and related to it, capable of expressing its spirit but unencumbered by the mass of poetically irrelevant details and complexities that make a civilization. Everybody knows this, right? Jeffers' sense of celebration of the place in and of itself has been noted by every thoughtful reader of his work. But how many have also noted that his initial and broadest definitions of the place, those where he conjures its meaningfulness, are all defined through poetry and poetics? He doesn't say they were living the way they lived in ancient Greece or in the Norse countries. He says, all is imagined very precisely through a poetic lens, a very specifically poetic lens. The Idylls of Theocritus and Virgil, perhaps up through Tennyson, Homeric epic, the sagas, all of them not merely historical, but rather representations of life, in some cases highly stylized representations of life, quote, purged of its ephemeral accretions. Then again, in the final clause, Jeffers says that life on the Monterey coast is not merely unencumbered by the mass of irrelevant details. He could have said that. He says it's unencumbered by the mass of poetically irrelevant details. Poetically irrelevant details. A telling adverb. It is the place and the way of life in the place that has poetic resonance for him. A resonance not merely in and of itself, but in relationship to the broadest possible understanding of literary history. Poetry, 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 poetry. What is a place? So let's look at the word itself. It seems a reasonable question to ask, given Jeffers' deep meditation on the poetic meaningfulness of this place and of all places, if we are to read his work as he explicitly calls out for it to be read. The reason to ask the question is because, as the foregoing examples and so much else of Jeffers' work suggests, it seems almost impossible to read Jeffers in any meaningful way without asking that question, as Jeffers seemed to frequently ask it himself, as we have begun to see already. His sense of place may seem simple at first because it is so powerful, it's so convincing and so organic. But on a closer look, it does seem almost successfully to resist the intelligence, as I've been trying to suggest, but with great beauty, with great enticing beauty. So I went and looked at the etymology of the word place. It's pretty interesting. It enters English about circa 1200, according to the online etymological dictionary, which is a great resource. Space, dimensional extent, room or area, from Old French place, meaning place, and directly from medieval Latin placea, place or spot, from Latin platea, courtyard, open space, broad way, avenue, from the Greek platea, or hodos, platea hodos, broad way, feminine of platis, broad, from the Proto-Indo-European root plat, to spread. Replace the Old English words stow and stead. And then there's a series of other definitions with which you'd be familiar. The interesting thing is that the cognates in other languages, also from the same Latin source, are the Italian piazza, Catalan plaza, Spanish plaza, Middle Dutch pleitze, and so on and so forth. Wide application in English covers meanings that in French require three words: place, lieu, and endroit. The Proto-Indo-European root plat is defined as follows. It means to spread. That's the root, the hypothetical Proto-Indo-European root, to spread. It's the extension of a root, another Proto-Indo-European root, pele, which means flat or to spread. It's very interesting to see how the word appears in other words in English. It is the same root of the words clan, flan, as in a custard that spreads out, flat, without curvature or projection, or the flat as in a story of a house, flounder, right? Flatfish, implant, piazza, place, plain, the plantain tree, plantation, plateau, platypus, platinum, platitude, and there are many others. One of the supplant, transplant, and then there are all these other cognates from Hittite and Sanskrit and Greek. One of the interesting words that it is cognate with is Plato, Platonic. So I went and looked at this. One has to wonder, given Jeffers' extraordinary background in language, that he didn't recognize this. The word Platonic enters English in the 1530s, meaning of or pertaining to the Greek philosopher Plato. From Latin Platonicus, from Greek Platonikos, the name in Greek is Platon, properly broad-shouldered, from the same Indo-European root. How many people know that that was not Plato's original name? Does anybody know Plato's actual name? I guess Plato was a nickname. That was his pen name. His original name was Aristocles. Maybe he had big shoulders. Maybe it had to do with his ideas. Although the pun is a bit of a stretch, this suggests that the very act of naming is by definition Platonic. And yet perhaps it is not such a stretch. For all place names conjure with being far more than they do with becoming. It takes a tremendous disruption, after all, a cataclysmic conflict, the death of a civilization and its language, for a place to lose its name and become another. Indeed, names, including place names, are often some of the oldest words in any language, so old that we don't know their sources. And place names, for example, the word meander is originally the name of a river, and guess what it does? It meanders in Asia. Place names nestle categorically within each other in a taxonomy that seems to carry across most cultures. A chair is a place. The room in which the chair sits is another larger place. The office. The part of the house and the house itself are larger places yet, as is the street on which the house stands, the neighborhood through which the street runs, the town that holds the neighborhood, its county, state, country, continent, hemisphere, and so on. And all these place names are true, and they all apply to the same place or group of places in a taxonomy. An egg takes its place in a nest. The branch on which the nest sits or rests is a place, as is the tree that has grown the branch, as is the stand of trees to which that tree belongs, as is the forest that includes the stand, as is the range of hills that the forest covers, and so on. All of these place names are also true. Further, all the specific places with their proper nouns are all understood to be not only places, but also kinds of places. In the enormous lexicon of English, which is the largest of any language, we have so many names for different kinds of places we could hardly ever account for them all. Consider just the names, for example, of categories of geological features. Take merely moving bodies of water, all of which are places. They're things, but they're in places. A seep, spring, trickle, rivulet, stream, creek, drain, tributary, brook, branch, arm, torrent, river, waterway, watercourse, channel. And if we transition to saltwater, as water always does, canal, seaway, a tidal wave takes place in a place. We just had one in Malaysia. Tsunami, current, and on and on. And these are mostly just the nouns, omitting other parts of speech that would relate to this phenomenon. Jeffers is such a strong poet of the Big Sur that we rightly consider him to have rendered it sacred, or something like sacred, at the very least memorably beautiful and meaningful, if not literally holy in any traditional sense. A question to ask, therefore, considering how important it is to him, is how he does this, what his rhetoric is. How can we read and understand how Jeffers moves so compellingly from naming and describing places to sacralizing them? The word place is a fairly common one, yet in addition to naming and thinking about specific places, Jeffers uses the word place and its cognates, meaning placed, places, placing, and so on, in his poems more than 275 times. Many of these instances are at first reading relatively ordinary and unremarkable, as when he writes in part 5 of Tamar, in a passage filled with a feverish dream set in very specific places. Many of you will recognize this. It actually starts in the middle of a long sentence. Tamar went down and saddled her own pony, a 4-year-old, as white as foam, and cantered past San Jose Creek mouth and the Caro's farm, where David Caro and his fanatical blue eyes that afterwards saw Christ on the hill smiled at her passing. And 3 miles up the Carmel Valley came to the Andrews place, there's the word, place, where the orchards ran to the river and all the air was rich with ripening apples. Think of all the detail there, right? Or when, to pick a late lyrical source rather than an early narrative one, in patronymic, a poem in which he meditates on the origin of the name Jeffers. And I'd point out it's an etymological exercise coming from Godfrey. He goes all the way back to the beginning of where his name may have come from. He muses that the first ancestor to bear that name, quote, has been dead 6 or 8 centuries, moldering in some forgotten British graveyard, nettles and rain slime. Nettlebed. I remember a place in Oxfordshire, that prickly name. Such uses of the word appear, at least at first, to be mere functions of syntactic necessity. For the Andrews place, he could have said the Andrews Ranch, or for a place in Oxfordshire, perhaps a town in Oxfordshire. And there are hundreds of these kinds of uses. But this is poetry, and presumably the choice matters, the choice to use the word place. And it did seem to matter deeply to Jeffers himself. Jeffers' very close and careful attention both to specific places and specific kinds of places may best be understood by looking more closely at some of the places where he foregrounds this very word or uses it in a more evocative way, rendering it, if not a categorical imperative, then a poetical one. So here I'm going to read a few poems and talk about them because I think they're not the only ones you could do this with. These are just some that are well-known and powerful and that appeal to me. Consider Tor House, written between 1926 and 28, and I'm sure that Jim or Rob can give me the day on which it was written, at about the time of Cawdor, where the word appears in the first line, the word place. The poem is worth quoting in full, both because of our theme and because, after all, this is the Tor House Foundation, so it seems like a good one to start with. You all know this, but I'll read it anyways. If you should look for this place after a handful of lifetimes, perhaps of my planted forest, a few may stand yet, dark-leaved Australians of the coast Cyprus, haggard with store drift. But fire and the axe are devils. Look for the foundations of sea-worn granite. My fingers had the art to make stone love stone. You will find some remnant. But if you should look in your idleness after 10,000 years, it is the granite knoll on the granite and lava tongue in the midst of the bay by the mouth of the Carmel River Valley. These 4 will remain in the change of names. You will know it by the wild sea fragrance of wind, though the ocean may have climbed or retired a little. You will know it by the valley inland that our sun and our moon were born from before the poles changed. And Orion in December evenings was strung in the throat of the valley like a lamp-lighted bridge. Come in the morning, you will see white gulls weaving a dance over blue water, the wane of the moon, their dance companion, a ghost walking by daylight, but wider and whiter than any bird in the world. My ghost, you needn't look for. It is probably here, but a dark one, deep in the granite, not dancing on wind with the mad wings and the day moon. That guy could write. Note once again the way Jeffers conflates time and space. I mean, nobody could do this, right? How can you come again in 10,000 years? You're not going to, probably. You're going to be with him in the granite. He brings time and space crashing together in a way that places large and small, living and inanimate, they become figures of different kinds. He brings them together in a way that places both large and small, living and inanimate, become figures of different kinds of time. The living things passing away, but the stone, the river, and the ocean enduring far longer. Quote, this place, Tor House, thus becomes a named thing that must be named to be contemplated, a named place, but whose existence is to be understood as beyond language, as something that will, after a handful of lifetimes, remain in the change of names, as perhaps only a remnant, ruined foundations, quote, foundations of sea-worn granite, but that after 10,000 years will only exist insofar as it is still granite. The place really has no name. It must be named to be conjured. The only alternative is silence. And yet Jeffers constantly wars with himself over the names that he also clearly loves, understanding them to be merely words, and words in a language that will die, not things. There is no confusion of res and verba here, no confusion of thing and word. The words, much as he loves them, even the names, cannot remain, and therefore are themselves, of course, merely provisional. Consider every place Jeffers names in the poem. And this will seem like almost like a skeleton of the poem if you just list the names. Tor House, his planted forest, specific trees, each in its place, dark-leaved Australian, coast cypress, foundations of sea-worn granite, the granite knoll on the granite, lava tongue in the midst of the bay, the mouth of the Carmel River Valley, the ocean, the valley inland, the sun, the moon, the poles, Orion, the throat of the valley, the blue water. These are all places of one kind or another. These are all places ranging from a single tree to distant stars and constellations, and all are placed in the continuum of time. If Ron Olowin were still with us, he would point to Jeffers' deep scientific knowledge of time, citing his end of astronomy, citing his understanding of the shifting of the poles. Thus, in one poem that is overtly about places, names, and time, Jeffers moves from the local to the global to the galactic, and from the immediate to the historical to the multi-millennial, 10,000 years, with suggestions even greater. And here is the paradox of names that appears again.